Guillermo Del Torro brings us another grim little tale, grim that is in a fairy tale sense in more ways than one. The story follows a little girl, Sally, who's moved by her estranged mother to her father's house in Rhode Island. It's a grand place, mansion-like indeed, but of course it harbours a terrible past. The house, it seems, is infested with some mischievous and frankly evil creatures that have a hunger for the teeth of little children. If only Sally could convince her father and his girlfriend of the danger that lurks within the house. Okay, this remake is a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, there's a rather well-trodden, quite traditional kind of children's horror story, one with monsters that are quite literally under the bed, complete with the old-school nastiness of the traditional fairy tales. Then there's the rather adult edge to the film that doesn't quite square with the rest of the tone of the film. The problem here is that Don't Be Afraid of the Dark doesn't quite know what it wants to be. It's part Gremlins, quite literally lifting from Joe Dante's classic dark comedy with a photosensitivity, for instance. But it's also entirely devoid of the humour. This wouldn't be a big deal, but the monsters who are equated to being fairies, only the most dark old-school fairy tale version of fairies, are frankly not nearly as threatening as maybe they could be. Mostly this is not only because they look like a poor cousin to the Gremlins, post-water and post-midnight snack, but because they're entirely CG, and very obviously so. Again, CG takes what could have been a good idea and makes the monster seem less threatening than a Muppet. Aside from the rather lacklustre monster, there is a bit of a problem. This movie is really something that should resonate with childish nightmares. In fact, it's a cinematic manifestation of childhood fears and nightmares of a fairly impressive quality. But it doesn't quite know if it wants to be an adult film or a kids' film. I honestly believe that had this been toned down, the brutal murder and the maiming, for instance, being taken down a notch or two, and perhaps if they'd aimed for a lower age rating that would allow for a younger audience, then this would have found the audience that would appreciate it. As it is, it's too adult for kids and too childish for adults. Sadly, because of the film's shortcomings, the adult audience is not so likely to buy into this one, so one's left wondering who this is actually aimed at. It's not to say that it's awful, not by a long shot. It's stylishly shot, thoughtful, if occasionally slow in pace, well performed, and it has plenty going for it. It's just a shame that it trips up on the one thing that it really should be. Scary. The ideas behind this are rather fascinating and pretty well handled, as the childhood traumas of the little girl play out through the manifestation of the monsters and the adult's behaviour and reactions to her situation. This element, it's well thought out, it's nicely played by all, particularly by the young actor who for the most part does surprisingly well performing against what is in fact an empty set. Don't Be Afraid of the Dark is a film with a lot of things it's trying to do. Some of it works, a lot of it doesn't quite get there. While it's a brave attempt and worth a watch, it's really nothing to shout about because it can't quite get past the fact that the monsters are a little more frightening than the rat monkey from Brain Dead. If there was one thing this film needed to be, it was frightening. Sadly, the audience that this may have resonated with in that way and in terms of its main protagonist will be excluded by the 15 rating that this film received. And that was probably for the sake of a couple of scenes, including some rather squirm-inducing dental violence and the fact that the little girl is carrying a knife in part of the film. It just seems like too high a price to have that in the film for me, considering the cost. Worth a watch, but only if you have nothing better to go see.